Okay, so just running through a quick parts checklist. This is what you should receive in your kit. We have the main body here, the piece that goes on the front, the brim which goes along the top, two eyepieces, two greeblies, one that's a bar and one that's a wheel, the two arms, and four pieces for the ears. That's two bases and two caps that go on top of there. You also have all your hardware here, two bearings, a few screws, some nuts, and some magnets. Okay, before we use any of those parts, let's prep the helmet for the ear installation. The first thing that we're going to have to do is cut off the existing ear greebly. You're going to want to do this as cleanly as possible. I used a coping saw, which is actually a jeweler's saw that I bought from StuMac a while ago. The trick here is going to be to not cut into the circular part of the ear. You only want to cut off the rectangular greebly. I got a little overzealous on my second cut and I cut into the circular part, which isn't very good, and it took a little bit of cleanup work with some Bondo to get it back to being flat. So if anything, you want to leave a little bit of the rectangular greebly and we can sand it off later rather than trying to cut the whole thing and accidentally cutting into the circular part. After those two cuts are made, we're just going to continue on with the coping saw and cut out the slots in the top of the ears. You want to mark this with a Sharpie or a magic marker or whatever you have handy. If you think of the ears as clocks, you want to make the cuts from about 12 o'clock to 2:30 or 12 o'clock to 8:30 on the other side. And that's going to be a little bit less than what you need to actually cut, but I think it's better to play it conservative and then sand out the additional distance later. This cut's actually really easy to make if you just try to stay as straight as you can going down. You should make a really clean cut. You want to do it about 1/8 of an inch in, maybe 1/4 of an inch off of the edge. I'll try to show as many pictures as I can here of my final cuts so you can get an idea of where these cuts go. When this is all done, we're going to start sanding out both the holes that we cut off of the greeblies and sanding out the rest of these slots. Okay, let's start with the hole from the greeblies. You want to use a pretty low grit. I'm using 60, and all you're going to do is stick it into the hole that came from the rectangular greebly and start sanding it out into a larger circle. You can use the 3D printed ear base as a sizing guide. Just keep sanding and checking until you have a really snug fit. You want to be able to get it in and out, but you don't want it to move around too much. Take that same 60 grit sandpaper and use it on the slots that you also just cut. You can use the arms of the binoculars as little sizing guides. Just make sure you can get those two circular ends in and out of each of the slots and there's some room to breathe in there. If the round part is tight going in, that's okay because it does get a little thinner after you get past the round part. It's actually pretty good to do that. So you want to get the round part in there and then be able to kind of swivel it around a little bit with not too much resistance. We can open up these slots a lot more later, but just to get them close, you want to be able to get the two stems in there and have them have a little bit of freedom moving around. Another thing to be mindful of is where you made the slot cut. There's going to be a little bit of a protrusion from where the ear was coming out. You really want to sand that down flat. That needs to be flush with the helmet, otherwise it's just going to rub up against the stems of the binoculars, and that's not good for anyone. So really take some time and sand down the portion of the ear that's sticking off the helmet down flat. Okay, so next we're going to install the hardware into the ear base here. There might be some 3D printed strings coming out here, just some extra little globs of filament. You just want to take a little pair of tweezers and get all those out if there are any. There might not be, but they're just going to get in the way. So clean this out a little bit with the tweezers. And then we're going to start with the nut. The nut has these little grippers at the bottom. So this is going to go in this way first. You're just going to want to drop a little piece of glue in here. Just a little bit of glue. You don't want to use a lot. I'm using Bob Smith Industries glue. So this is CLA. It's super strong. You do not need a lot. And then you just want to push this nut into its recess here. Once it's kind of in there, you could just take a pair of pliers or something and push it the rest of the way. Really get it into its housing there. If there's any excess glue anywhere, you want to wipe that off. Make sure everything is super flush. Really push it in. Cool, and then that's ready just to sit for a little bit while that glue cures. Next up, we're going to grab a stack of 2 magnets. You will have 8 total, but just separate off 2 of them like this so that they're still attached. And what you're going to do is you're going to mark an X on both sides. So essentially what you're doing by doing this is marking the opposite pole on each one. Since we know that they're touching in the middle, these two X's will be opposite poles. So now that we have the two X's, we can add a drop of glue. And we can just put our magnets right in here. You want to get them super flush, so just give them a push on the desk. And with the two X's facing up, we know that we're dealing with the opposite poles pointing up. I repeated the same process with the ear cap using the opposite poles here. So why all this attention paid to using the opposite poles of the magnets? Here's why. So when we have our final installation, if we put that on there, that fits like that. But if we tried to put it on the other way, it repels. So this way you can put the cap on, do all your painting and your weathering, and then you don't have to worry about putting it back on the exact same way because this only fits one way. So that'll keep everything lined up. Gluing this thing on is a bit of a breeze, just a little bit of glue on the outer rim, push that into the hole and make sure that the magnets are perfectly parallel with the ground plane. Do this on both sides and let that sit for a bit. After that's set, go to the inside of the helmet and put a ring of glue around where the plastic meets the resin, and then that should be a pretty tight bond. That's not. Next up is attaching the arms to the main piece of the binoculars. If your kit came with any of these helper discs attached, you'll want to just trim them off. A simple cutting tool will do the trick. The arms are going to come on a raft. This raft helps keep them in place throughout the print process, and you can basically just peel this raft off. It's going to take a little force, and just be mindful of the fact that these arms are not unbreakable. So use as much force and be as careful as you need to be to get this raft off without breaking them. There's also going to be some support material on the circular part of the arms. This should come off fairly easily. It's made to come right off, so just a simple pair of pliers should peel it right off. Do a little test fit to make sure everything looks good. You'll want to do a cursory sanding of everything before you start to glue. Focus on the surface area that is about to be attached. Really get it flat and smooth and properly scuffed so that the glue has something to bind to. I'm using 60 grit sandpaper for this. To take it one step further, I'm also going to do a round of Bondo glazing putty on all three parts before I glue them together. It's going to have to be done anyway, so I'm going to do it while the parts are separate and easier to work with, but this is totally optional. Once you're ready, grab your glue. I'm using Bob Smith Industries medium gap fill, which is the purple stuff. Also grab some rubber bands or some vices if that's what you prefer. Add glue to both surfaces and then attach them and hold them in place until your glue cures. I'm going to let them sit overnight just to be extra super sure. Okay, my parts are glued together and I did an additional round of Bondo glazing putty on the new joints just to get everything nice and flush. Now we can do our first test fit in the helmet just to make sure that everything looks good. Once everything looks good, you can do a test install of all of the hardware. This might reveal some spots that need a little work in terms of sanding. If there's any of the interior arms that are rubbing up against the side of the helmet, just sand it out a little bit until it's no longer an issue. With everything installed, you can also begin sanding out the rest of those slots to get them to the final up and down positions that you want. Okay, the next thing that we need to do is get the binoculars to stay in the up position. Right, they're obviously happy to stay in the bottom position because of gravity, but once they get up here, they're going to want to fall right back down, which is not something that we want. Luckily, at the moment, they still need a little bit of sanding, so I can kind of get them to stay up here a little bit with friction. I've already installed a magnet into the bridge of the binoculars here, and now I'm going to put another magnet, which is the same type of magnet, into the mohawk of the helmet. So since this is in the position that we want and the magnet's already there, all we have to do is make this one find it, and now that's the position that the magnet needs to be in. So what I'm going to do is mark that with a marker, and then I'm going to sand out that smooth resin. So when we glue it in, the glue will have something to grab onto. I might even try to rough up the magnet a little bit, and then we can glue it into place here. And then as long as we keep the poles as they should be, these two should always find each other right in the spot that they need to be. Okay, you can see there my original markings, and I sanded pretty well in there, so I'm just going to repeat that setup with the binoculars and glue the magnet into place. Here you can see the magnet is glued into place, and if we do a quick test, You can see just as it gets close to the magnet pulls it into place. And that's happy to stay up. And just it comes right back off. Nothing too hard to pull on. So we have the down position and the up position. It's also worth mentioning that the mounting system has changed a little bit since I started filming this video. This recess in the side of the arm was built for this bearing, which is an M5 bearing with a 19mm radius. That fit in there pretty nicely, but the profile of it was too big, how far it stuck off the side of the arm. I couldn't get it to fit through the slot of the helmet, so I've switched it out for this. This is also an M5 bearing, but this only has an 8mm radius. So this is quite a bit better. It's also a lot thinner. It's instead of being 5mm thick, it is only 2.5mm thick. And to install this, I've put it inside of this little bearing holder, and this bearing holder slips right into the old recess like that. It's a pretty nice fit, and it's also removable, which is good. You don't have to glue this in. You can trim it to fit the way you want to, and it's better than trying to squeeze the bearing in there anyway. So this works out pretty perfectly. So then next up is just the final install of the binoculars. The two stems slip right into the sides of the helmet here. Then you just use the M5 screws that came with your kit. Screw them all the way in so that they go into the recess of the bearing. Once the hardware is in, the kit's installed, you could add your greeblies to each side. And you're set to go. Down position's easy, gravity takes care of that, and then the up position is held in place by the magnet. You have some pretty good rotation between the 2 points, and this is happy to stay at the top. So I think that's going to do it for the installation of the binoculars. If you have any problems with the installation of your kit, don't hesitate to contact me. Be sure to check out my main channel for the binoculars video that I'm going to put on there. It's a little different than this one, less kit-oriented and more just general binocular talk. So thanks for purchasing the kit. I hope it works out for you. And yeah, definitely, again, don't hesitate to contact me if you have any problems. Thanks a lot.